The Green Room by Walter de Mare. Read by Connor Kay. Only Mr. Eliot's choicer customers were in his own due season let into his little secret, namely, that at the far end of his shop, beyond, that is, the little table on which he kept his account books, his penny bottle of ink, and his rusty pen, there was an annex. He first allowed his victims to ripen, and preferred even to see their names installed in the pages of his fat, dumpy ledger before he decided that they were really worthy of his little privilege. Alan, at any rate, though a young man of ample leisure and moderate means, had been browsing and pottering on and off in the shop for weeks before he even so much as suspected there was a hidden door. He must, in his innocence, have spent pounds and pounds on volumes selected from the vulgar shelves before his own initiation. This was on a morning in March. Mr. Eliot was tying up a parcel for him. Having no scissors handy, he was burning off the ends of the string with a lighted match. And as if its small flame had snapped at the same moment, both the string and the last strands of formality between them, he glanced up, almost roguishly, at the young man through his large round spectacles, with the remark, "Perhaps, sir, you'd like to take a look at the books in the parlour," and with a bird-like jerk of his round, bald head, indicated where the parlour was to be found. Alan had merely looked at him for a moment or two out of his blue eyes, with his usual pensive vacancy. "I didn't know there was another room," he said at last, "but then I suppose it wouldn't have occurred to me to think there might be. I fancied these books were all the books you had." He glanced over the dingy hugger-mugger of second-hand literature that filled the shelves and littered the floor, a mass that would have 20-fold justified the satiety of a Solomon. "Oh dear me, no, sir," said Mr. Eliot, with the pleasantest confidentiality. "All this is chiefly riff-raff, but I don't mention it except to those gentlemen who are old clients, in a manner of speaking. What's in there is all in the printed catalogue, and I can always get what's asked for. Apart from that, there's some who, well, at any rate, I don't, sir. But if, by any chance, you should care to take a look round at any time, you would, I'm sure, be very welcome. This is an oldish house, as you may have noticed, sir, and out there is the oldest parts of it. We call it the parlour, Mrs. Eliot and me. We got it from the parties that were here before we came. Take a look now, sir, if you please. It's a nice little place." Mr. Eliot drew aside. Books, and particularly old books, tend to be dusty company. This may account for the fact that few antiquarian booksellers are of Falstaffian proportions. They are more usually lean, ruminative, dryish spectators of life. The gnawing of the worm in the tome is among the more melancholy of nature's lullabies, and the fluctuations in the price of firsts and of mint states must incline any temperament, if not towards cynicism, at least towards the philosophical. Herodotus tells of a race of pygmies whose only diet was the odour of roses, and though Morocco leather is sweeter than roses, it is less fattening. Mr. Eliot, however, flourished on it. He was a rotund little man with a silver watch chain from which a gold locket dangled, and he had uncommonly small feet. He might have been a ballet master. "You make your way up those 4 stairs, sir," he went on, as he ushered his customer between the curtains. "Turn left, down the passage, and the door's on the right. It's quiet in there, but that's no harm done. No hurry, sir." So Alan proceeded on his way. The drugget on the passage floor showed little trace of wear. The low-panelled walls had been whitewashed. He came at last to the flowered china handle of the door beyond the turn of the passage, then stood for a moment, lost in surprise. But it was the trim cobbled garden beyond the square window on his right that took his glance rather than the room itself. Yellow crocuses, laden with saffron pollen, stood wide agape in the black mould, and the greenish buds of a bush of lilac were tapping softly against the glass. And above was a sky of the gentlest silken blue, wonderfully still. He turned and looked about him. The paint on the wainscot and cornice must have once been of a bright apple green. It had faded now. A gator-leg table was in the far corner, beyond the small paned window, and on his left, with 3 shallow steps up to it, was another door. And the shelves were lined from floor to ceiling with the literary treasures which Mr. Elliot kept solely for his elect. So quiet was the room that even the flitting of a clothes moth might be audible, though the brightness of noonday now filled it to the brim. For the 3 poplars beyond the lilac bush were still almost as bare as the frosts of winter had made them. In spite of the flooding March light, in spite of this demure sprightliness after the gloom and disorder of the shop he had left behind him, Alan, as in his languid fashion he turned his head from side to side, became conscious first and foremost of the age of Mr. Elliot's pretty parlour. The paint was only a sort of let's pretend. The space between its walls seemed, indeed, to be as much a reservoir of time as of light. The panelled ceiling, for example, was cracked and slightly discoloured. So were the green shutter cases to the windows, while the small and beautiful chimney-piece, its carved marble lintel depicting a cupid with panpipes, dancing before a smiling goddess under a weeping willow, enshrined a grate that at this moment contained nothing, not even the ashes of a burnt-out fire. Its bars were rusty, and there were signs of damp in the moulded plaster above it. A gentle breeze was now brisking the tops of the poplar trees, but no murmur of it reached Alan where he stood. With his parcel tucked under his arm, he edged round softly from shelf to shelf, and even after so cursory an examination as this, and it was one of Mr. Elliot's principles to mark all his books in plain figures, he realized that his means were much too moderate for his appetite. He came to a standstill, a little at a loss. What was he to do next? He stifled a yawn. Then, abstracting a charming copy of Hesperides by that human and divine poet, Robert Herrick, he seated himself idly on the edge of the table and began to turn over its leaves. They soon became vocal. Ask me why I do not sing to the tension of the string as I did long ago when my numbers full did flow. Grief, I me, hath struck my lute, and my tongue at one time mute. His eye strayed on, and he read slowly, muttering the words to himself as he did so. The departure of the good Damon. What can I do in poetry, now the good spirit's gone from me? Why, nothing now but lonely sit and overread what I have writ. Alan's indolence was even more extreme. He was at this moment merely overreading what he had read, and what he had read again and again and again. For the eye may be obedient while the master of the mind sits distrait and aloof. His wits had gone wool-gathering. He paused, then made yet another attempt to fix his attention on the sense of this simple quatrain. But in vain, for in a moment or two his light, clear eyes had once more withdrawn themselves from the printed page, and were once more, but now more intently, exploring the small green room in which he sat. And as he did so, though nothing of the bright external scene around him showed any change, out of some daydream it seemed, of which until then he had been unaware, there had appeared to him, from the world of fantasy, the image of a face. No known or remembered face, a phantom face, as alien and inscrutable as are the apparitions that occasionally visit the mind in sleep. This in itself was not a very unusual experience. Alan was a young man of an imaginative temperament, and possessed that inward eye which is often, though not always unfailingly, the bliss of solitude. And yet there was a difference. This homeless image was at once so real in effect, so clear, and yet so unexpected. Even the faint shadowy colours of the features were discernible. The eyes dark and profound, the hair drawn back over the rather narrow temples of the oval head. A longish, quiet, intent face, veiled with reverie and a sort of vigilant sorrowfulness, and yet possessing little of what at first sight might be called beauty, or what at least is usually accepted as beauty. So many and fleeting, of course, are the pictures that float into consciousness at the decoy of a certain kind of poetry that one hardly heeds them as they pass and fade. But this, surely, was no after-image of one of Herrick's earthly yet ethereal Electras, or Athenias, or Dianames, vanishing like the rainbows in a fountain's falling waters. There are degrees of realization, and whatever good spirit this shadowy visitant may have represented, and whatever its origin, it had struck some observer in Alan's mind mute indeed, and had left him curiously disquieted. It was as if in full sight of a small fishing smack, peacefully becalmed beneath the noonday blue, the spars and hulk of some such phantom as the Flying Dutchman had suddenly appeared upon the smooth sea green. Though this perhaps was hardly a flattering account of it. Anyhow, it had come, and now it was gone, except out of memory, as similar images do come and go. Mere figment of a daydream, then, though this vision must have been, Alan found himself vacantly searching the room as if for positive corroboration of it, or at least some kind of evidence that would explain it away. Faces are but faces, of course, whether real or imaginary, and whether they appear in the daytime or the dark. But there is at times a dweller behind the eye that looks out, though only now and again, from that small window. And this looker out, unlike most, seemed to be innocent of any attempt at concealment. Here I am, and you. That had seemed to be the mute question it was asking, though with no appearance of needing an answer. And, well, Alan distrusted feminine influences. He had once or twice in his brief career loved not wisely, but too idealistically, and for the time being he much preferred first editions. Besides, he disliked mixing things up, and how annoying to be first slightly elated and then chilled by a mere fancy. The sun, in his diurnal round, was now casting a direct beam of light from between the poplars through one of the little panes of glass in Mr. Elliot's parlour. It limned a clear-cut shadow pattern on the fading paint of the frame and on the floor beneath. Alan watched it and was at the same time listening, as if positively in hope of detecting that shadow's indetectable motion. In the spell of this reverie, time seemed to have become of an almost material density. The past hung like cobwebs in the air. He turned his head abruptly. He was beginning to feel a little uneasy, and his eyes now fixed themselves on the narrow panelled door above the 3 stairs on the other side of the room. When consciousness is thus unusually alert, it is more easily deceived by fancies. And yet, so profound was the quiet around him, it seemed improbable that the faint sound he had heard, as of silk very lightly brushing against some material obstacle, was imaginary. Was there a listener behind the door? Or was there not? If so, it must be one as intent as himself, but far more secret. For a full minute, and as steadily as a cat crouching over a mouse's hole, though there wasn't the least trace of the predatory on his mild, fair features. He scrutinized the key in the lock. He breathed again, and then, with finger in book to keep his place, tiptoed across the room, and gently, by a mere finger's breadth, opened the door. Another moment and he had pushed it wider. Nothing there. Exactly as he had expected, of course. And yet, why at the same moment was he both disappointed and relieved? He had exposed a narrow staircase, unstained, uncarpeted. Less than a dozen steep steps up was another door, a shut door, with yet another pretty flowered china handle and china finger plates to it. A rather unusual staircase, too, he realized, since unless one or the other of its two doors was open, it must continually be in darkness. But you never know what oddity is going to present itself next in an old, rambling house. How many human beings, he speculated, as he scanned this steep and narrow vacancy, must in the 2 or 3 centuries gone by have ascended and descended that narrow ladder, as abrupt as that of Jacob's dream. They had come disguised in the changing fashions of their time. They had gone, leaving apparently not a rack behind. Well, that was that. This March morning might be speciously bright and sunny, but in spite of its sunshine, it was cold. Books, too, may cheer the mind, but even when used as fuel, they are apt to fail to warm the body, and rust on an empty grate diminishes any illusion of heat its bars might otherwise convey. Alan sighed, suddenly aware that something which had promised to be at least an arresting little experience had failed him. The phantasmal face, so vividly seen, and even watched for a moment, had already become a little blurred in memory. And now there was a good deal more disappointment in his mind than relief. He felt like someone who has been cheated of a game he never intended to play. A particularly inappropriate simile, nonetheless, for he hadn't the smallest notion what the stakes had been, or, for that matter, what the game. He took up his hat and walking stick, and still almost on tiptoe, and after quietly but firmly shutting both doors behind him, went back into the shop. "I think I will take this, please," he said almost apologetically to the old bookseller, who, with his hands under his black coat-tails, was now surveying the busy world from his own doorstep. "Certainly, sir." Mr. Elliot wheeled about and accepted the volume with that sprightly turn of his podgy wrist with which he always welcomed a book that was about to leave him forever. "Ah, the Hesperides, sir. I'll put the 3 into one parcel. A nice tall, clean copy, I see. It came, if memory serves me right, from the library of Colonel Anstey, sir, who purchased the Talbot letters, and at a very reasonable price, too. Now if I had a first in this condition—" Alan dutifully smiled. "I found it in the parlour," he said. "What a charming little room, and garden, too. I had no idea the house was so old. Who lived in it before you did? I suppose it wasn't always a bookshop." He tried in vain to speak naturally, and not as if he had plums in his mouth. "Lived here before me, now?" the bookseller repeated ruminatively. "Well, sir, there was first, of course, my immediate predecessor. He came before me, and we took over his stock. Something of a disappointment, too, when I came to go through with it." "And before him?" Alan persisted. "Before him, sir, I fancy this was what might be called a private house. You could see, if you looked round a bit, how it has been converted. It was a doctor's, I understand, a Dr. Marchmont's, and what we call the parlour, sir, from which you have just emerged, was always, I take it, a sort of book-room. Leastways, some of the books there now were there then, with the book-plate and all. You see, the Mr. Brown, who came before me, and who, as I say, converted the house. He bought the doctor's library. Not merely medical and professional works neither. There was some choice stuff besides, and a few moderate specimens of what is known in the trade as the curious, sir. Not that I go out of my way for it myself. Alan paused in the doorway, parcel in hand. A bachelor, I suppose. The doctor, sir, or Mr. Brown? The doctor. Well now, that I couldn't rightly say, replied Mr. Elliot cheerfully. Let us hope not. They tell me, sir, it makes things more homely-like to have a female about the house, and, he raised his voice a little, I'll warrant that Mrs. Elliot, sir, if she were here to say so, would bear me out. Mrs. Elliot, in fact, a pasty-looking old woman with a mouth like a cod's and a large marketing basket on her arm, was at that moment emerging out from behind a curtained doorway. Possibly her husband had caught a glimpse of her reflection in his spectacles. She came on with a beetle-like deliberation. "What's that you were saying about me, Mr. Elliot?" "This gentleman was inquiring, my love, if Dr. Marchmont, as was, lived in a state of single blessedness, or if there was a lady in the case." Mrs. Elliot fixed a slow, flat look on her husband, and then on Alan. "There was a sister or niece or something, so they say, but I never knew anything about them, and I don't want to," she declared, and Alan, a little chilled by her demeanour, left the shop. Not that one fish-like glance of Mrs. Elliot's censorious eye had by any means freed his fancy of what had passed. In the days that followed, he could never for an instant be sure when or where the face that reverie had somehow conjured up out of the recesses of his mind on his first visit to the bookseller's parlour was not about to reappear. And it chose the oddest of moments. Even when his attention was definitely fixed on other things, it would waft itself into his consciousness again, and always with the same serene, yet vivid, naive, yet serious question in the eyes. A question surely that only life itself could answer, and that not always with a like candour or generosity. Alan was an obstinate young man in spite of appearances, but to have the rudiments of an imagination is one thing, to be at the beck and call of every passing fancy is quite another. He was not, he reassured himself, as silly as all that. He held out for days together, and then, when he had been left for 24 hours wholly at peace, he suddenly succumbed. A westering sun was sharply gilding its windows when he once more made his way into Mr. Elliot's parlour. It was empty, and almost at the same instant he realized how anxious he had been that this should be so, and how insipid a bait as such the little room now proved to be. He hadn't expected that, and yet, not exactly insipid, its flavour had definitely soured. He wished he had never come. He tried to make up his mind to go, ill at ease, angry with himself, and as if in open defiance of some inward mentor, he took down at random a fusty old quarto from its shelf, and seating himself on a chair by the table, he began, or rather attempted, to read. Instead, with downcast eyes shelled in by the palm of his hand, and leaning gently on his elbow in an attitude not unlike that of the slippered and pensive Keats in the portrait, he found himself listening again. He did more than listen. Every nerve in his body was stretched taut, and time ebbed away. At this tension, his mind began to wander off again into a dreamlike vacuum of its own, when, what was that? A voice within whispered at him. A curious thrill ebbed through his body. It was as though unseen fingers had tugged at a wire, with no bell at the end of it. For this was no sound he had heard, no stir of the air, and yet in effect it so nearly resembled one that it might have been only the sigh of the blast of the east wind at the window. He waited a minute, then, with a slight shiver, glanced up covertly but steadily through his fingers. He was shocked by what he saw, yet not astonished. It seemed as if his whole body had become empty, and yet remained as inert and heavy as lead. He was no longer alone. The figure that stood before him in the darker corner there, and only a few paces away, was no less sharply visible and even more actual in effect than the objects around her. One hand, from a loose sleeve, resting on the edge of the door to the staircase, she stood looking at him, her right foot, with its high-heeled shoe, poised delicately on the lowest of the 3 steps. With head twisted back sidelong over her narrow shoulder, her eyes were fixed on this earthly visitor to her haunts. As he sat, hand to forehead, drawn up stiff and chill at the table, she was watching Alan. And the face, though with even fewer claims to be beautiful, and none to be better than knowing and wide awake, was without any question the face he had shared with Herrick's Hesperides. A peculiar vacancy, like a cold mist up from the sea, seemed to have spread over his mind, and yet he was alert to his very fingertips. Had she seen he had seen her? He couldn't tell. It was as cold in the tiny room as if the windows were wide open and the garden beyond them full of snow. The late afternoon light, though bleakly clear, was already thinning away, and, victim of this silly decoy, he was a prisoner who, in order to regain his freedom, must pass her way out. He stirred in his chair, his eyes now fixed again on the book beneath them. And then at last, as if with confidence restored, he withdrew his hand from his face, lifted his head, and affecting a boldness he far from felt, deliberately confronted his visitor. At this, the expression on her features, her whole attitude, changed too. She had only, at this moment, seen that he had seen her then. The arm dropped languidly to her side. Her listless body turned a little, her shoulders slightly lifted themselves, and a faint provocative smile came into her face, while the dark, jaded eyes, resting on his own, remained half mocking, half deprecatory, almost as if the two of them, he and she, were old cronies, who had met again after a long absence from one another, with ancient secrets awaiting discreet discussion. With a desperate effort, Alan managed to refrain from making any answering signal of recognition. He stared back with a face as blank as a turnip. How he knew with such complete assurance that his visitor was not of this world, he never attempted to explain to himself. Real. She was at least as real as a clearly lit reflection of anything seen in a looking-glass, and in effect on his mind was more positive than the very chair on which he was sitting, and the table beneath his elbow to which that chair was drawn up. For this was a reality of the soul, and not of the senses. Indeed, he himself might be the ghost, and she the dominating pervasive actuality. But even if he had been able to speak, he had no words with which to express himself. He was shuddering with cold, and had suddenly become horribly fatigued and exhausted. He wanted to get out of all this, and yet knew not only that this phantasm must have been lying in wait for him, but that sooner or later she would compel him to find out what she wanted of him, that she meant to be satisfied. Her face continued to change in expression even while he watched her. Its assurance seemed to intensify. The head stooped forward a little, the narrow pallid slanting eyelids momentarily closed, and then, With a gesture not merely of arm or shoulder, but of her whole body, she once more fixed him with a gaze, more intense, more challenging, more crammed with meaning than he had supposed possible in any human eye. It was as if some small wicket gate into the glooms of purgatory had suddenly become thronged with bright lit faces. Until this moment, they had been merely eyeing one another, while time's sluggish moments ebbed away. They had been merely looking at one another. Now there had entered those glazed, dark, fixed blue eyes, the very self within. It stayed there, gazing out at him transfixed, the pleading, tormented, dangerous spirit within that intangible husk. And then the crisis was over. With a slow dragging movement of its head, Alan had at last succeeded in breaking the spell. He had turned away. A miserable disquietude and self-repulsion possessed him. He felt sick, body and soul. He had but one thought, to free himself once and for all from this unwarranted ordeal. Why should he have been singled out? What hint of any kind of encouragement had he been responsible for? Or was this ghostly encounter an experience that had been shared by other visitors to the old bookseller's sanctum, maybe less squeamish than himself? His chilled, bloodless fingers clenched on the open page of the book beneath them. He strove in vain to master himself, to fight the thing out. It was as if an icy hand had him in its grip, daring him to stir. The evening wind had died with the fading day. The 3 poplars, every budded, double-curved twig outlined against the glassy grey of the west, stood motionless. Daylight, even dusk, was all very well, but supposing this presence, as the dark drew on, ventured a little nearer. And suddenly his alarms, as much now of the body as of the mind, were over. She had been interrupted. A footstep had sounded in the corridor. Alan started to his feet. The handle of the door had turned in the old brass lock. He watched it. With a jerk he twisted his head on his shoulders. He was alone, yet again the interrupter had rattled impatiently with the door handle. Alan at last managed to respond to the summons, but even as he grasped the handle on his own side of it, the door was pushed open against him, and a long bearded face peered through. "Pardon," said this stranger. "I didn't realize you had locked yourself in." In the thin evening twilight that was now their only illumination, Alan found himself blushing like a schoolgirl. "But I hadn't," he stammered. "Of course not. The catch must have jammed. I came in here myself only a few minutes ago." The long face, with its rather watery blue-grey eyes, placidly continued to survey him in the dusk. "And yet, you know," its owner drawled, with a soupçon of incredulity, "I should have guessed myself that I've been poking about in our patron's shop out there for at least the best part of half an hour. But that, of course, is one of the charms of literature. You haven't chanced, I suppose, on a copy of The Vulgar Errors, Sir Thomas Browne?" Alan shook his head. "The B's, I think, are there in the corner," he replied. "Alphabetical, but I didn't notice the errors." Nor did he stay to help his fellow customer find the volume. He hurried out, and this time he had no spoil to present to the old bookseller in recognition of the rent due for his occupation of the parlour. A whole week went by, its last few days the battleground of a continuous conflict of mind. He hadn't, he assured himself with the utmost conviction, the faintest desire in the world to set eyes again on what he had set eyes on. That was certain. It had been the oddest of shocks to what he had thought about things, to what had gone before, and, yes, to his vanity. Besides, The more he occupied himself with and pondered over his peculiar little experience, the more probable it seemed that it and she and everything connected with her had been nothing but a cheat of the senses, a triumph of self-deception, a pure illusion, induced by the quiet, the solitude, the stirrings of a springtime at the window, the feeling of age in the room, the romantic associations, and last, to the Herrick. All this served very well in the middle of the morning or at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but a chance waft of the year's first waxen hyacinths, the onset of evening, a glimpse of the waning moon, at any such oblique reminder of what had happened, these pretty arguments fell flat as a house of cards. Illusion! Then why had everything else in his life become, by comparison, so empty of interest, and himself at a loose end? The thought of Mr. Eliot's bookshop at such moments was like an hypnotic lure. Cheat himself as he might, he knew it was only cheating. Distrust the fowler as he might, he knew what nets he was in. How gross a folly to be at the mercy of one vehement coupling of glances. If only it had been that other face. And yet, supposing he were wrong about all this, supposing this phantasm really was in need of help, couldn't rest, had come back for something. There were things one might want to come back for, and even for something which he alone could give. What wonder this restless conflict of mind reacted on his body and broke his sleep? Naturally, a little invalidish in his appetite, Alan now suffered the pangs of a violent attack of indigestion, and at last he could endure himself no longer. On the following Tuesday, he once more pushed open the outer door of Mr. Eliot's bookshop, with its jangling bell, and entered, hot and breathless, from out of the pouring rain. "There was a book I caught sight of," he panted out to the old gentleman as he came in, "when I was last here, you know, in the other room. I won't keep you a minute." At this, the bookseller's bland eye fixed itself an instant on the fair, flushed face, almost as if he too could a tale unfold. "Let me take your umbrella, sir," he entreated. "Ah, soppin', a real downpour, but very welcome to the farmers, I'll be bound. If, for once in a while, they'd only say so. No hurry whatever, sir." Downpour indeed it was. As Alan entered the parlour, the cold, sullen gush of rain on the young lilac buds and the cobblestones of the little yard in the dreary leaden light at the window resounded steadily on. He had set out in the belief that his one desire was to prove that his ghost was no ghost at all, that he had been the victim of a pure hallucination. Yet through his journey, with only his umbrella for company, he had been conscious of a thrill of excitement and expectation, and now that he had closed the door behind him and had shut himself in, the faded little room in this obscurity at once began to influence his mind in much the same fashion as the livid gloom of an approaching thunderstorm affects the scenery of the hills and valleys over which it broods. And this, it soon seemed, was to be his sole reward. His excitement fizzled out. With every passing moment, his heart fell lower. He had gone away, filled with a stark, irrational hatred of the poor, restless, phantasmal creature who had intruded on his solitude. He had come back only to realize not only that she herself had been his lodestone, but that, even though any particular spot may undoubtedly be haunted, it by no means follows that its ghost is always at home. Everything about him seemed to have changed a little, or was the change only in himself? In this damp air, the room smelt of dry rot and mouldering leather. Even the pretty grate looked thicklier scurfed with rust, and the books on the shelves had now taken to themselves the leaden livery of the weather. "Look not too closely on us," they seemed to cry. "What are we but the memorials of the dead? And we too are swiftly journeying towards the dust." The prospect from the window was even more desolating. Nonetheless, Alan continued to stare stupidly out of it. By the time he had turned away again, he had become certain, though now he couldn't tell, that he need have no apprehension whatever of intangible company today. Mr. Elliott's parlour was emptier than he supposed a room could be. It seemed as if by sheer aversion for its late inmate had he exercised it, and, irrational creature that he was, a stab of regret followed. He turned to go. He gave a last look round, and paused. Was it that the skies had lightened a little, or had he really failed to notice at his entry that the door at which his visitor had appeared was a few inches open? He stepped across softly and glanced up the staircase. Only vacancy there, too, but the door was also ajar. The two faint daylights from above and below mingled midway. For a moment or two he hesitated. The next he had stolen swiftly and furtively up the staircase and had looked in. This room was not only empty but abandoned. It was naked of any stick of furniture and almost of any trace of human occupation, yet, with its shallow bow window, low ceiling, and morning sun, it must once in its heyday have blossomed like the rose. The flowered paper on its walls was dingy now. A few darker squares and oblongs alone showed where pictures had once hung. The brass gas bracket was green with verdigris, and a jutting rod was the only evidence of the canopy where once a bed had been. But even vacancy may convey a sense of age and tell its tale. Alan was looking into the past. Indeed, the stale remnant of some once pervasive perfume still hung in the musty atmosphere of the room, though its sole refuse consisted of a few dust-grimed books in a corner and, on a curved white narrow shelf that winged the minute fireplace, a rusty hairpin. Alan stooped, and very gingerly, with gloved finger and thumb, turned the books over. A blistered, green-bound Enoch Arden, a small thick copy of The Mysteries of Paris, Dante Gabriel Rossetti's House of Life, a Nightingale Valley, a few damp, fly-blown shockers, some of them in French and paper-bound, and last, a square black American cloth-bound exercise book with E.F. cut out with a clumsy penknife at one of the top corners. The cockled cloth was slightly greened. He raised the cover with the extreme tips of his fingers, stooped forward a little, and found himself in the window light, scanning with peculiar intensity the vanished lineaments of a faded photograph. The photograph of a young woman, in clothes somehow made the more old-fashioned in appearance by the ravages of time and light on the discolored cardboard. He knew this face, and yet not this face. For days past, it had not been out of his mind more than a few hours together. But while his first impression had been that of the vivid likeness of the one to the other, what next showed clearest were the differences between them. Differences that stirred his heart into a sudden tumult. The hair in the photograph was dressed in pretty much the same fashion, drawn up and back from the narrow temples across the widening head. The lips were, possibly, not so full, certainly not so dark. And though the cheek even of this much younger face was a little sunken, these faded eyes, a fading only of the paper depicting them and not of age, looked out at him without the faintest trace of boldness or effrontery. They were, it is true, fixed profoundly on his own, but they showed no interest in him, little awareness, No speculation, only a remote, settled melancholy. What strange surmises, the young man reflected, must the professional photographer at times indulge in, when, from beneath his ink-black, inquisitorial velvet cowl, he peers into his camera at a face as careless of human curiosity as this had been. The young woman in the photograph had made, if any, a more feeble attempt to conceal her secret sorrows than a pall to conceal its bier, or a broken sepulchre its bones. At a breath, the young man's aversion had died away. A shame-stricken compassion of which he had never dreamed himself capable had swept over him in its stead. He gazed on for a minute or two at the photograph, this withering memento, which not even the removing men seemed to have considered worth flinging into a dustbin. Then he opened the book at random, towards the middle of it, and leaning into the light at the window, read these lines. My midnight lamp burns dim with shame. In heaven the moon is low. Sweet sharer of its secret flame, arise and go. Haste, for dawn's envious gaping grave bids thee not linger here, though gone is all I am and have, thy ghost once absent, dear. He read them over again, then glanced stealthily up and out. They were a voice from the dead. It was as if he had trespassed into the echoing cold of a vault. And as he looked about him, he suddenly realized that at any moment he might be interrupted, caught, prying. With a slight glance over his shoulder, he pushed the photograph back into the old exercise book, and, tucking this under his arm beneath his coat, tiptoed down the unlighted stairs into the parlor. It had been a bold venture, at least for Alan, for of all things in this world he disliked by far the most being caught out in any little breach of the conventions. Suppose that old cod-like Mrs. Elliot had caught him exploring this abandoned bedroom, after listening yet again for any rumor either of herself or of her husband. He drew out from the lowest shelf nearby 2 old sheepskin folios, seated himself in full view of the door that led into the shop, and having hidden the exercise book well within the cover of these antiquated tomes, he began to turn over its pages. The trick took him back to his early school days. The sun, the heat, the drone of bees at the window, a settling wayward fly, the tick of the clock on the wall, and the penny blood half concealed in his arithmetic book. He smiled to himself. Wasn't he being kept in now? And how very odd he should be minding so little what, only an hour before, he had foreseen he would be minding so much. How do ghosts show that you needn't expect them? Not even in their chosen haunts. The book he was now examining was not exactly a penny blood. In despite of appearances, it must have cost at least 6pence. The once black ink on its pages had faded, and mildew dappled the leaves. The handwriting was irregular, with protracted loops, and what was written in the book consisted of verses, interlarded with occasional passages in prose, and a day or a date here and there, and all set down apparently just as it had taken the writer's fancy. And since many of the verses were heavily corrected, and some of them underlined, Alan concluded, without any very unusual acumen, that they were homemade. Moreover, on evidence as flimsy as this, he had instantly surmised who this E.F. was, and that here was not only her book, but a book of her own authorship. So completely, too, had his antipathy to the writer of it now vanished out of memory, so swiftly had the youthful, tragic face in the photograph secreted itself in his sentiments, that he found himself reading these scribbled effusions with a mind all but bereft of its critical faculties, And of these the young man had hitherto rather boasted himself. Still, poetry, bad or good, depends for its very life on the hospitable reader, as tinder awaits the spark. After that, what else matters? The flame leaps, the bosom glows. And, as Alan read on, he never for an instant doubted that here, however faultily expressed, was what the specialist is apt to call a transcript of life. He knew of old, how remotely of old it now seemed, what feminine wiles are capable of. But here, surely, was the truth of self to self. He had greedily, and yet with real horror, looked forward to his reappearance here, as if Mr. Eliot's little parlour was the positive abode of the evil one. And yet now that he was actually pecking about beneath the very meshes of his nets, he was drinking in these call notes, as if they were cascading down upon him out of the heavens from the throat of Shelley's skylark itself. For what is time to the echoes of Eros? Had he not, with Chaucer's help, once fallen head over ears in love with the faithless Chryside? He drank in what he had begun to read, as if his mind were a wilderness thirsty for rain, though the pall of cloud that darkened the window behind him was supplying it in full volume. He was elated, and at the same time dejected at the thought that he was perhaps the first human creature, apart from the fountainhead, to sip of these secret waters. And he had not read very far before he realized that its contents referred to an actual experience as well as to one of the imagination. He realized, too, that the earlier poems had been written at rather long intervals, and though he very much doubted if they were first attempts, that their technique tended to improve as they went on, at least that of the first 20 poems or so. With a small ivory pocket paper knife, which he always carried about with him, he was now delicately separating page 12 from page 13, and he continued to read at random. There was sweet water once, where in my childhood I watched for the happy innocent nonce, day's solemn clouds float by. O age, blur not that glass, kind heaven still shed thy rain. Even now sighs shake me as I pass those gentle haunts again. He turned over the page. Lay my heart, and find thy peace, where thine old solitary pastures lie. Their light, their dews need never cease, nor sunbeams from on high. Lay and happy dream, nor roam, though wild the hills may shine. Once there, thou soon wouldst long for home, as I for mine. And then, do you see, oh do you see, speak in some inward self that accent knows, biding the orient east its rose disclose, and daybreak wake in me. Do you hear, oh do you hear, this heart whose pulse like menacing night bird cries? Dark, utter dark, my loved, is in these eyes, when gaunt goodbye draws near. And then, after a few more pages, there is a garden in her face, my face. Woe is me, were that my all. Nay, but myself, though thine its grace, thy fountain is thy peach-bloomed wall. Come soon that twilight dusky hour, when thou thyself shalt enter in, and take thy fill of every flower, since thine they have always been. No rue, no myrrh, no nightshade, oh, tremble not, spirit, all is well. For love's is that lovely garden, and so there only pleasures dwell. Turning over the limp, fusty leaves one by one, he browsed on. When you are gone, and I'm alone, from every object that I see, its secret source of life is flown. All things look cold and strange to me. Even what I use, my rings, my gloves, my parasol, the clothes I wear. Once she was happy, now she loves. Once young, they cry, now carked with care. I wake and watch when the moon is here, a shadow tracks me on, and I, darker than any shadow, fear her fabulous inconsistency. That sphinx the future marks its prey. I, who was ardent, sanguine, free, starve now in fleshly cell all day, and yours the rusting key. And then, your maddening face befools my eyes, your hand I wake to feel, lost in deep midnight's black surmise, its touch my veins congeal. What peace for me in star or moon, what solace in nightingale, they tell me of the lost and gone, and dawn completes the tale. A note in pencil, the point of which must have broken in, followed at the foot of the page. All this means all but nothing of what was in my mind when I began to write it. Dawn! I look at it, read it. It is like a saucer of milk in a cage of asps. I didn't know one's mind could dwell only on one thought, one face, one longing, on and on without any respite, and yet remain sane. I didn't even know, until when, it was possible to be happy, unendurably happy, and yet as miserable and as hopeless as a devil in hell. It is as if I was sharing my own body with a self I hate and fear and shake in terror at, and yet am powerless to be rid of. Well, never mind. If I can go on, that's my business. They mouth and talk and stare and sneer at me. What do I care? The very leaves of the trees whisper against me, and the last night came thunder. I see my haunted face in every stone, and what cares he? Why should he? Would I, if I were a man? I sit here alone in the evening, waiting. My heart is a quicksand biding its time to swallow me up. Yet it isn't even that I question now whether he ever loved me or not. I only thirst and thirst for him to come. One look, a word, and I am at peace again, at peace. And yet I wonder sometimes if it is even conceivable that I still love him. Does steel love the magnet? Surely that moon which shone last night with her haggard glare in both our faces abhors the earth from which, poor wretch, she parted to perish, and yet from which she can never, never utterly break away. Never, never, never. Oh God, how tired I am, knowing as I do, as if my life were all being lived over again, that only worse lies in wait for me, that the more I feel, the less I am able to please him. I see myself dragging on, and that other sinister mocking one within rises up and looks at me. What? And shall I never come into my own? Alan had found some little difficulty in deciphering the faint, blurred, penciled handwriting. He decided to come back to this page again, and turned it over and read on. Your hate I see and can endure, nay, must, endure the stark denial of your love. It is your silence like a cankering rust that I am perishing of. What reck you of the blinded hours I spend, crouched on my knees beside a shrouded bed? Grief even for the loveliest has an end, no end in one whose soul it is lies dead. I watched the aged who've dared the cold, slow ice that creeps from limb to limb, from sense to sense, yet never dreamed this also is the price which youth must pay for a perjured innocence. Yours that fond, lingering lesson, be content. Not one sole moment of its course I rue. The all I had was little, now it's spent. Spit on the empty purse, 'tis naught to you. And then these lines on Ophelia. She found an exit from her life. She to an earthly green room sped, where parched up souls distraught with strife sleep and are comforted. Hamlet, I know that dream-drugged eye, that self-coiled melancholic mien. Hers was a happy fate to die. Mine, her foul, might have been. And then, Tomorrow waits me at my gate, while all my yesterdays swarm near, and one mouth whines, too late, and one is dumb with fear. Was this the all that life could give, me, who from cradle hungered on, body and soul aflame to live, giving my all, and then be gone? O sun in heaven, to don that shroud, when April's cuckoo thrilled the air, light thou no more the fields I loved, be only winter there. And then, have done with moaning, idiot heart. If it so be that love has wings, I with my shears will find an art to still its flutterings. Wrench off that bandage too will I, and show the imp he is blind indeed. Hot irons shall prove my mastery, he shall not weep, but bleed. And when he is dead and cold as stone, then in his mother's book I'll con the lessons none need learn alone, and callous as she play on. He raised his eyes. The heavy rain had ebbed into a drifting drizzle. The day had darkened. He stared vacantly for a moment or two out of the rain-drenched window, and then, turning back a few of the damp, cockled leaves, once more resumed his reading. And when at last I journeyed where all thought of you I must resign, will the least memory of me be fair, or will you even my ghost malign? I plead for nothing, nay, time's tooth, that frets the very soul away, may prove at last your slander's truth, and me the slut you say. There followed a series of unintelligible scrawls. It was as if the writer had been practicing a signature in various kinds of more or less affected handwritings. Esther de Berg, Esther de Borg, Esther de Borg, Esther de Borg, E. de Borg, E. D. B, E. D. B, E. D. Iceborg, Esther de la Iceborg, Esther de Borgia, Esther Cesarina de Borgia, Esther de Bauch, Esther de Bausch, Esther de Bosch, and then this unfinished scrap. Why cheat the heart with old deceits? Love, was it love in thine, could leave me thus grown sick of sweets, and the words sounded on, forlornly, and even a little self-pityingly, in Alan's mind. Sick of sweets, sick of sweets. He had had enough for today. He shut the book, lifted his head, and with a shuddering yawn and a heavy frown on his young face, once more stared out of the window. This E.F., whoever she was, had often sat in this room, alert, elated, drinking in its rosy reflected morning sunshine from that wall, happy even in being merely herself, young, alone, alive. He could even watch in fancy that intense lowered face as she stitched steadily on, lost in a passionate reverie, while she listened to as dismal a downpour as that which had but lately ceased on the moss-grown cobbles under the window. It's only one's inmost self that matters, she had scribbled at the end of one of her rhymes. And then, how long afterwards? The days, empty of everything but that horror and dryness of the heart, when desire had corrupted and hope was gone, and every hour of solitude must have seemed to be lying in wait only to prove the waste, the bleakness, the desolation to which the soul within can come. No doubt, in time, they would learn even a bookworm to be a worm. That is one of the charms of literature, as the bland, bearded, supercilious gentleman had expressed it, but he wouldn't have sentimentalized about it. Oddly enough, it hadn't yet occurred to Alan to speculate what kind of human being it was to whom so many of these poems had been addressed, and to whom seemingly every one of them had clearer or vaguer reference. There are ghosts, for whom spectre is the better word. In this, the gloomiest hour of an English spring, he glanced again at the door he had shut behind him in positive hope that it might yet open once more, that he was not so utterly alone as he seemed. Sick, sick. Surely, surely a few years of life could not have wreaked such horrifying changes in any human face and spirit as that. But the least promising method, apparently, of invoking a visitant from another world is to wait on to welcome it. Better, perhaps, postpone any little experiment of this kind until after the veils of nightfall had descended. Not that he had failed to notice how overwhelming is the evidence that when once you have gone from this world, you have gone forever. Still, even if he had been merely the victim of an illusion, it would have been something just to smile or to nod in a common friendly human fashion, to lift up the dingy little black exercise book in his hand, merely to show that its owner had not confided in him in vain. He was an absurdly timid creature, tongue-tied when he wanted most to express himself, and yet, if only. His glance strayed from door to book again. It was curious that the reading of poems like these should yet have proved a sort of solace. They had triumphed, even over the miserable setting destiny had bestowed on them. Surely literature, without any vestige of merit in it, couldn't do that. A veil of daydream drew over the fair and rather effeminate face, and yet the young man was no longer merely brooding. He was beginning to make plans. And he was making them without any help from the source from which it might have been expected. Seeming revenants, of course, in this busy world are not of much account. They make indelible impressions if they do chance to visit one, though it is imprudent perhaps to share them with the skeptic. None the less, at this moment he was finding it almost impossible to recall the face, not of the photograph, but of his phantasm. And though there was nothing in the earlier poems he had read to suggest that they could not have been the work of the former, was it conceivable that they could ever have been the work of that other one? But why not? To judge from some quite famous poets' faces, their owners would have flourished at least as successfully in the pork-butchering line. Herrick himself, well, he was not exactly ethereal in appearance, but what need for these ridiculous unanswerable questions? Whoever E.F. had been, and whatever the authorship of the poems, he himself could at least claim now to be their only re-begetter. At this thought, a thrill of excitement had run through Alan's veins. Surely the next best thing to publishing a first volume of verse of one's own, and that he had now decided never to attempt, is to publish someone else's. He had seen worse stuff than this in print, and on hand-made paper too. Why shouldn't he turn editor? How could one tell for certain that it is impossible to comfort, or, for that matter, to soothe the vanity of some poor soul simply because it has happened to set out on the last long journey a few years before oneself? Mere initials are little short of anonymity, and even kindred spirits may be all the kinder if kept at the safe distance which anonymity ensures. But what about the old bookseller? An Englishman's shop is his castle, and this battered old exercise book, Alan assumed, must fully as much as any other volume on the shelves around him be the legal property of the current tenant of the house, or possibly the ground landlord's. He determined to take Mr. Elliot into his confidence, but very discreetly. With this decision he got up, dismayed to discover that it was now a full half hour after closing time. None the less, He found the old bookseller sitting at his table and apparently lost to the cares of business beneath a wire-protected gas bracket now used for an electric bulb. The outer door was still wide open, and the sullen clouds of the last of evening seemed to have descended even more loweringly over the rain-soaked streets. A solitary dog loped by the shrouded entrance. Not a sound pierced the monotony of the drizzle. "I wonder," Alan began, keeping the inflections of his voice well in check, "I wonder if you have ever noticed this particular book. It is a manuscript. Verse." "Verse, sir?" said the bookseller, fumbling in a tight waistcoat pocket for the silver case of his second pair of spectacles. "Well now, verse in manuscript. That doesn't sound if it's likely to be of much value. Though finds there have been, I'll grant ye. Poems and sermons, we are fairly glutted out with them nowadays. Still, there was this Omar Khayyam fuss, sir, so you never know." He adjusted his spectacles and opened the book where the book opened itself. Alan stood over the old man's shoulder and read with him. "Once in kind arms, alas, you held me close. Sweet to its sepals was the unfolding rose. Why then, though wind-blown hither, thither, I languish still, rot on and wither, yet live, God only knows." A queer, intent, and almost hunted expression grew over Mr. Elliott's greyish face as he read on. "Now I wonder," he said at last, firmly laying the book down again and turning an eye as guileless as an infant's to meet Alan's scrutiny. "I wonder now, who could have written that? Not that I flatter myself to be much of a judge. I leave that to my customers, sir." "There is an E.F. cut out on the cover," said Alan, "and," the words came with difficulty, "there is a photograph inside. But then I suppose," he added hastily, automatically putting out his hand for the book and withdrawing it again, "I suppose it's just a loose photograph that doesn't prove anything. Not, at least, to whom it belonged, the book, I mean." "No, sir," said the bookseller, as if he thoroughly enjoyed little problems of this nature. "In a manner of speaking, I suppose it don't." But he made no attempt to find the photograph, and a rather prolonged pause followed. "It's quiet in that room there," Alan managed to remark at last. "Extraordinarily quiet. You haven't yourself, I suppose, ever noticed the book before." Mr. Elliot removed both pairs of spectacles from the bridge of his nose. "Quiet is the word, sir," he replied, in a voice suiting the occasion, "and it's quieter yet in the two upper rooms above it, especially of a winter's evening. Mrs. Elliot and me don't use that part of the house much, though there is a good bit of lumber stowed away in the nearest of 'em. We can't sell more than a fraction of the books we get, sir, so we store what's over up there for the pulpers. I doubt if I've even so much as seen the inside of the upper room these 6 months past, and as a matter of fact," he pursed his mouth and nodded, "what with servant girls and the like, and not everybody being as commonsensical as most, we don't mention it much." The bookseller's absent eye was now fixed on the rain-soaked street, and Alan waited, leaving his "what?" unsaid. "You see, sir, that lady that lived with Dr. Marchmont here, his niece, or ward, or whatever it may be, well, they say she came to what they call an untimely end. A love affair. But there, for the matter of that, you can't open your evening newspaper without finding more of such things than you get in a spring season's fiction. Strychnine, sir, that was the way of it, and it isn't exactly the poison I myself should choose for the purpose. It erects the body like an arch, sir, so." and with a gesture of his small, square hand, Mr. Elliot pictured the effect in the air. Dr. Marchmont hadn't much of a practice by that time, I understand, but I expect he came to a pretty sudden standstill when they saw that on the bed. A tall man, sir, with a sharp nose. Alan refrained from looking at the bookseller. His eyes stayed fixed on the doorway, which led out into the world beyond, and they did not stir. But he had seen the tall, dark man with the sharp nose as clearly as if he had met him face to face, and was conscious of a repulsion far more deadly than the mere features would seem to warrant. And yet, why should he have come to a standstill quite like that if— But the bookseller had opened the fusty, mildewed book at another page. He sniffed, then having rather pernicketly adjusted his spectacles, read over yet another of the poems. "Esther," came the whisper from my bed. "Answer me, Esther, are you there?" 'Twas waking self to self that's dead, called on the empty stair. Stir not that pit, she is lost and gone. A Jew decoyed her to her doom. Sullenly knolls her passing bell, mocking me in the gloom. The old man gingerly turned the leaf and read on. Last evening, as I sat alone, thimble on finger, needle and thread, light dimming as the dusk drew on, I dreamed that I was dead. Like wildering timeless plains of snow, which bitter winds to ice congeal, the world stretches far as sight could go, 'neath skies as hard as steel. Lost in that naught of night I stood, and watched my body, brain and breast, in dreadful anguish in the mould, groped toward its final rest. Its craving dreams of sense dropped down, like crumbling maggots in the sod. Spectral I stood, all longing gone, exiled from hope and God. And you I loved, who once loved me, and shook with pangs this mortal frame, were sunk to such as infamy, that when I called your name, its knell so racked that sentient clay, that my lost spirit, lurking near, wailed like the damned, and fled away, and awoke me stark with fear. He pondered a moment, turned back the leaf again, and holding the book open with his dumpy forefinger, "A Jew, now," he muttered to himself. "I never heard any mention of a Jew. But what if you follow me?" he added, tapping on the open page with his spectacles. "What I feel about such things as these is that they're not so much what may be called mournful as morbid, sir. They rankle. I don't say, mind you, that there isn't a ring of truth in them, but it's so put, if you follow me, as to make it worse. Why, if all our little mistakes were dealt with in such a vengeful spirit as this, where would any of us be? And death. Say things out loud, sir, by all means. But what things? It isn't human nature. And what's more," he finished pensively, "I haven't noticed that the stuff sells much better for it." Alan had listened, but not paid much attention to these moralizings. "You mean," he said, "that you think the book did actually belong to the lady who lived here, and that it was she herself who wrote the poems. But then, you see, it's E.F. on the cover, and I thought you said the name was Marchmont." "Yes, sir, Marchmont. Between you and me, sir, there was a Mrs., I understand, but she went away. And who this young woman was, I don't rightly know. Not much good, I fancy, at least." He emptily eyed again the blurred lettering of the poem. "But there, sir," he went on with decision, "there's no need that I can see to worry about that. The whole thing's a good many years gone, and what consequence is it now? You'd be astonished how few of my customers really care who wrote a book so long as wrote it was. Which is not to suggest that if we get someone with a name, I mean, to lay out the full story of the young woman in a sort of foreword, there might not be money in it. There might be. It doesn't much signify nowadays what you say about the dead, not legally, I mean. And especially these poets, sir. It all goes in under biography. Besides, a suicide's a suicide, all the world over. On the other hand, and he glanced over his shoulder, I rather fancy Mrs. E. wouldn't care to be mixed up in the affair. What she reads, she never much approves of, though that's the kind of reading she likes best. The ladies can be so very scrupulous. Alan had not seen the old bookseller in quite so bright a light as this before. I was wondering, Mr. Elliot, he replied in tones so frigid they suggested he was at least 20 years older than he appeared to be, is whether you would have any objection to my sending the book myself to the printers. It's merely an idea. One can't tell. It could do no harm. Perhaps whoever it was who wrote the poems may have hoped some day to get them printed. You never know. It would be at my expense, of course. I shouldn't dream of taking a penny piece, and I would rather there were no introduction by any one. There need be no name or address on the title page, need there? But this is, of course, only if you see no objection. Mr. Elliot had once more lifted an inch or two of the back cover of the exercise book, as if possibly in search of the photograph. He found only this penciled scrawl. Well, 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 squeaked the kitten to the cat. Mousie refuses to play any more, so that's the end of that. He shut up the book and rested his small plump hand on it. I suppose, sir, he inquired discreetly, there isn't any risk of any infringement of copyright, I mean, he added, twisting round his unspectacled face a little in Alan's direction. There isn't likely to be anybody who would recognize what's in here. I am not, of course, referring to the photograph, but a book, even nowadays, may be what you call too true-spoken, when it's new, I mean. And it's not so much Mrs. E. I have in mind now as the police. He whispered the word, the police. Alan returned his blurred glance without flinching. Oh no, he said. Perhaps I should merely put EF on the title page and say it had been printed privately. I'm quite prepared to take the risk. The cold tones of the young man seemed to have a little daunted the old bookseller. Very well, sir. I will have just a word with a young lawyer friend of mine, and if that's all right, why, sir, you are welcome. And the book could be sold from here. Sold? Why, yes, sir. They'll have plenty of respectable company, at any rate. But if Alan had guilelessly supposed that the mere signing of a cheque for £33 and 10 shillings in settlement of a local printer's account would finally exile a ghost that now haunted his mind far more persistently than it could ever have haunted Mr. Elliot's green parlour, he soon discovered his mistake. He had kept the photograph, but had long since given up any attempt to find his way through the maze in which he found himself. Why? Why should he concern himself with what an ill-starred life had done to that young face? If the heart, if the very soul is haunted by a ghost, need one heed the frigid dictates of the mind? Infatuated young man, he was in servitude to one who had left the world years before he was born, and had left it, it seemed, only the sweeter by her exit. He was sick for love of one who was once alive, but was now dead, and, Why should he deny it? Mrs. E. wouldn't. Damned. Still, except by way of correspondence, he avoided Mr. Elliot and his parlour for weeks, until, in fact, the poems were finally in print, until their neat grey-deckled paper covers had been stitched on, and the copies were ready for a clamorous public. So it was early one morning in the month of June before he once more found himself in the old bookseller's quiet annex. The bush of lilac, stirred by the warm, languid breeze at the window, was shaking free its faded, once fragrant tassels of bloom and tapering heart-shaped leaves from the last dews of night. The young poplars stood in gold-green torches against the blue of the sky. A thrush was singing somewhere out of sight. It was a scene worthy of Arcady. Alan had trailed through life without any positive need to call on any latent energy he might possess, and now that he had seen through the press, his first essay in publishing a reaction had set in. A cloud of despondency shadowed his young features as he stared out through the glass of the window. Through the weeks gone by, he had been assuring himself that it was no more than an act of mere decency to get the poems into print. A vicarious £30 or so, just to quiet his conscience. What reward was even thinkable? And yet, but a few nights before, he had found himself sitting up in bed in the dark of the small hours, just as if there had come a tap upon the panel of his door, or a voice had summoned him out of a dream. He had sat up, leaning against his bed rail, exhausted by his few hours' broken sleep, and in the vacancy of his mind had appeared, yet again in silhouette, against the dark, the living presentment of the young face of the photograph. Merely the image of a face floating there, with waxen downcast lids, the features passive as those of a death mask, as unembodied an object as the after-image of a flower. There was no speculation in the downcast eyes, and in that lovely, longed-for face, no, nothing whatever for him. And it had faded out as a mirage of green-fronded palm trees and water lilies in the lifeless sands of the desert. He hadn't any desire to sleep again that night. Dreams might come, and wakeful questions pestered him. How old was he when the first of the poems was written? How old when no more came, and she herself had gone on, that barren, awful road of disillusionment, satiety, self-disdain. Had she, even when young and untroubled, ever been happy? Was what she had written even true? How far are poems true? And what had really happened? What had been left out? You can't even tell yourself what goes on in the silent places of your mind when you have swallowed, so to speak, the dreadful outside things of life. What, for example, had Measure for Measure to do with the author of Venus and Adonis, and what Don Juan with Byron as a child? One thing, young women of his day didn't take their little affairs like that. They kept life in focus. But that ghost, the ravages, the paint, the insidiousness, the very clothes. Coming to that, then, who the devil had he been taking such pains over? The question kept hammering at his mind, day after day. It was still unanswered, showed no promise of an answer. And the Arcadian scene beyond the windows suddenly became an irony and a jeer. The unseen bird itself sang on in vulgar mockery. Come off it, come off it, come off it. Dolt, dolt, dolt. He turned away out of the brightness of the light and fixed his eyes on the bulky brown paper package that contained the printed volumes. It was useless to stay here any longer. He would open the package, but merely to take a look at a copy and assure himself that no ingenuity of the printer had restored any little aberration of spelling or of punctuation which he himself had corrected 3 times in the proofs. He knew the poems, or some of them, by heart now. With extreme reluctance, he had tried 1 or 2 of them on a literary friend. An anonymous thing, you know. I came across it in an old book. The friend had been polite rather than enthusiastic. After, cigarette between fingers, idly listening to a few stanzas, he had smiled and asked Alan if he had ever read a volume entitled Poems of Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. Well, there you are, a disciple of Acton's, dear boy, if you ask me. Stuff as common as blackberries. And Alan had welcomed the verdict. He didn't want to share the poems with anybody. If nobody bought them and nobody cared, what matter? All the better. And he wasn't being sentimental about them now either. He didn't care if they had any literary value or not. He had entrusted himself with them, and that was the end of the matter. What was Hecuba to him, or he to Hecuba? What? And what did it signify that he had less right to the things even than Mrs. Elliot, who fortunately was never likely to stake out any claim? The moral ashbins old women can be, he thought bitterly. Simply because this forlorn young creature of the exercise book had been forced at last to make her exit from the world under the tragic but hardly triumphant arch of her own body, this old woman had put her hand over her mouth and looked volumes at the poor old henpecked husband of hers, even at the mention of her name. Suicides, of course, are a nuisance in any house, but all those years gone by, and what did they know the poor thing had done to merit their insults? He neither knew nor cared, yet for some obscure reason steadily wasted at least 5 minutes in untying the thick knotted cord of the parcel instead of chopping it up with his pocket knife in the indignant fashion which he had admired when he visited the printers. The chastest little pile of copies was disclosed at last in their grey-blue covers and with their enrichingly rough edges. The handmade paper had been an afterthought. A further check was due to the printer, but Alan begrudged not a farthing. He had even incited them to be expensive. He believed in turning things out nicely, even himself. He and his pretty volumes were a pair. Having opened the parcel, having neatly folded up its prodigal wrappings of brown paper, and thrown away the padding and hanked the string, there was nothing further to do. He sat back in Mr. Elliot's old Windsor chair, leaning his chin on his knuckles. He was waiting, though he didn't confess it to himself. What he did confess to himself was that he was sick of it all. Age and life's usage may obscure, cover up, fret away a fellow creature, at least as irrevocably as 6 feet of common clay. When he then raised his eyes at some remote inward summons, he was already a little hardened in hostility. He was looking clean across the gaily lit room at its other occupant, standing there in precisely the same attitude. The high-heeled shoe coquettishly arched on the lower of the 3 steps, the ridiculous flaunting hat, the eyes aslant beneath the darkened lids, casting back on him their glitter from over a clumsy blur that was perfectly distinct on the cheekbone in the vivid light of this June morning. And even this one instant's glimpse clarified and crystallized all his old horror and hatred. He knew that she had seen the tender first fruits on the table. He knew that he had surprised a gleam of triumph in her snakish features. and he knew that she no more cared for that past self and its literary exercises than she cared for his silly greenhorn tribute to them. What then was she after? The darkening, glittering, spectral eyes were once more communicating with him with immense rapidity, and yet were actually conveying about as empty or as mindless a message as eyes can. If half-extinguished fires in a dark room can be said to look coy, these did. But a coyness practiced in a face less raddled and ravaged by time than by circumstance is not an engaging quality. Arch, my God, arch was the word. Alan was shivering. How about the ravages that life's privy pour had made in his own fastidious consciousness? Had his heart been a shade more faithful, would the horror, which he knew was now distorting his rather girlish features and looking out of his pale blue eyes, have been quite so poisonously bitter? Fortunately, his back was turned to the window, and he could in part conceal his face with his hand before this visitor had had time to be fully aware what the face was saying. She had stirred. Her head was trembling slightly on her shoulders. Every tinily exquisite plume in the mauve ostrich feathers on her drooping hat trembled as if in sympathy. Her ringed fingers slipped down from the door to her narrow hip. Her painted eyelids narrowed, as if she were about to speak to him. But at this moment there came a sudden flurry of wind in the lilac tree at the window, ravelling its dried-up flowers and silky leaves. She stooped, peered, and then, with a sharp, practiced, feline, seductive nod, as bold as grass-green paint, she was gone. An instant or two, and in the last of that dying gust, the door above, at the top of the narrow staircase, as if in a sudden access of bravado, violently slammed. Touch me, tap at me, force me, if you dare. The impact shook the walls and rattled the windows of the room beneath. It jarred on the listener's nerves with the force of an imprecation. As abrupt a silence followed. Nauseated and slightly giddy, he got up from his chair, resting his fingers automatically on the guileless pile of books, took up his hat, glanced vacantly at the gilded Piccadilly maker's name on the silk lining, and turned to go. As he did so, a woeful, shuddering fit of remorse swept over him, like a parched-up blast of the sirocco over the sands of a desert. He shot a hasty, strangulated look up the narrow, empty staircase as he passed by. Then, "Oh God!" he groaned to himself. "I wish, I pray, you poor thing, you could only be a little more at peace, whoever, wherever you are, whatever I am." And then he was with the old bookseller again, and the wordly wise old man was eyeing him as ingeniously as ever over his steel-rimmed glasses. "He isn't looking quite himself," he was thinking. "Bless me, sir," he said aloud. "Sit down and rest a bit. You must have been overdoing it. You look quite het up." Alan feebly shook his head. His cheque was almost as colourless as the paper on which the poems had been printed. Small beads of sweat lined his upper lip and damped his hair. He opened his mouth to reassure the old bookseller, but before he could utter a word, they were both of them caught up and staring starkly at one another, like conspirators caught in the act. Their eyes met in glassy surmise. A low, sustained rumble had come sounding out to them from the remoter parts of the shop, which Alan had but a moment before left finally behind him. The whole house shuddered as if at the menace of an earthquake. "Bless my soul, sir," cried the bookseller. "What in merciful heaven was that?" He hurried out, and the next instant stood in the entry of his parlour, peering in through a dense fog of dust that had now obscured the light of the morning. It silted softly down, revealing the innocent cause of the commotion. No irreparable calamity. It was merely that a patch of old cracked plaster ceiling had fallen in, and a mass of rubble and plaster was now piled up, inches high, on the gate-leg table and the chair beside it, while the narrow lathes of the ceiling above them, a few of which were splintered, lay exposed like the bones of a skeleton. A thick film of dust had settled over everything, intensifying with its grey veil the habitual hush of the charming little room. And almost at one and the same moment, the old bookseller began to speculate first what damages he might have been called upon to pay if his young customer had not, in the nick of time, vacated that chair, and next, that though perhaps his own little stock of the rare and curious would be little worse for the disaster, Alan's venture might be very much so. Indeed, the few that were visible of the little pile of books, but that morning come virgin and speckless from the hands of the binders, were bruised and scattered, and as Mr. Elliot eyed them, his conscience smote him. "Softly now, softly," he muttered to himself, "or we shall have Mrs. E. down on this in pretty nearly no time." But Mrs. E. had not heard. No footfalls sounded above, nothing stirred. All remained as it might be expected to remain, and Alan, who meanwhile had stayed motionless in the outer shop, at this moment joined the old bookseller and looked in on the ruins. "Well, there, sir," Mr. Elliot solemnly assured him, "all I can say is, it's a mercy you had come out of it, and by no more than a hair's breadth." But Alan made no answer. His mind was a void. He was listening again, and so intently that it might be supposed the faintest stirrings, even on the uttermost outskirts of the unseen, might reach his ear. It was too late now, and in any case, it hadn't occurred to him to add to the title page of his volume that well-worn legend, "The heart knoweth its own bitterness, and a stranger doth not intermeddle with his joy." But it might at least have served for his own brief apologia. He had meant well, it would have suggested. You never can tell. As they stood there, then, a brief silence had fallen on the ravaged room, and then a husky, querulous, censorious voice had broken out behind the pair of them. "Mr. E., where are you?" Hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that reading of The Green Room by Walter de la Mare. It's Connor here. I'm back for a little bit of a discussion of the story this time. It's not going to be so much of an analysis, because really I think a lot of the story speaks for itself, but the context of the story and Walter de la Mare himself, I think, will be interesting to discuss, and may help you appreciate the story a little bit better if you were thinking that that was a bit of a bland ghost story. So let's discuss Walter de la Mare. De la Mare is probably best remembered today for his poetry, and after that, probably for his weird fiction and horror or ghost stories. De la Mare being first and foremost a poet is really quite important when you read his fiction. You will notice if you read any of his stories that they can be fairly slow, and they focus a lot on the internal state of the characters and the atmosphere in the story. One of de la Mare's other well-known ghost stories is called All Hallows, and it's about a man who visits a church, and basically it's a very long, atmospheric story which doesn't have much in the way of plot or mystery. It is a ghost story, I'm pretty certain, although I think it speaks to the character of the story that I'm not actually certain if it is. It's very, very sparse, and it's more about the atmosphere in this story and evoking a certain mood than it is about the plot points or about certain exciting things happening. So Delamere's writing style, I would say, is very similar to poetry in the sense that it's not about being definite or precise, or being very clear. It's more about evoking a feeling or a mood or an atmosphere. And you'll see that in this story. There is a fairly definite plot to the story, but it's more about Alan's internal feelings and about the ambiguity of the situation and the atmosphere of the situation, and the green room itself. So let's discuss this ambiguity in the story and what we do know and what we don't know. So when Alan goes into the green room, he encounters a vision of this ghost, which is sort of maybe a hallucination or maybe there's really a ghost there. We don't quite know. In either way, something is having an influence on him, some kind of supernatural force. He eventually discovers the notebook, which has the initials EF carved into the cover, which presumably is the initials of the owner of the notebook. And we see the name Esther written in the notebook. So we could make the assumption that Esther was the woman who owned the notebook and is also the ghost. Most of what we know about Esther comes from the poetry in the book. And you can really see Delamere having a good time here and flexing his poetical skills by telling the story through the poetry. We do find out a little bit about the reality of Esther's life from Mr. Elliot and his wife, Mrs. Elliot, the owners of the bookstore. So we know that there was a doctor who lived there. He had a female relation of some kind, presumably who was younger than him, who also lived there. And then the rest we know. Oh, and we know that she committed suicide as well with strychnine. And probably one of the more ghoulish or horrific parts of the story is when Mr. Elliot describes what strychnine does to a person when they take it. It's pretty awful. But the rest of what we know about Esther comes from her notebook and her own poetry, which is really her subjective opinion or her subjective view of her life and her situation. Basically, it's a story of unrequited love. So Esther's in love with this guy and he rejects her, or they have a relationship, but eventually he leaves her. And then out of despair, she eventually commits suicide. That's what we know, or at least think we know, from her poetry and from the other information we're given. Now, the reason I say it's what we think we know is because of the level of ambiguity in the story. What exactly the ghost wants is really the central point of the story. Alan can't get the ghost out of his head. It's like she is exerting some kind of influence on him. And in order to sort of exercise or help the ghost rest, which is often, the central point in ghost stories, when there's a haunting, it's about how to resolve the unfinished business of the ghost. And he thinks that by publishing this poetry, maybe that will happen. But there's also sort of this notion that Alan is maybe doing it a bit self-centeredly, in the sense that he doesn't have permission to publish this poetry. This is somebody's intimate diary, their intimate feelings, and he's making that public. Whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing to do, he doesn't seem to really know, and he doesn't really know if it's what the ghost wants either. The reason I say that Alan maybe has some selfish motives is because of a quick reference in the story to the fact that Alan had decided that he would never try to have his own poetry published, that this is like a dream that he maybe had at one point but gave up. But it's said that he's going to turn editor, I think is the phrase used, and become an editor and edit and release someone else's poetry. So maybe in a sense, Alan is vicariously living his dream, which he had of publishing poetry. And that would be a bit of a selfish thing to do if it wasn't what Esther would have wanted, if it's going against her wishes, which I think it actually is. At the end of the story, the way the story concludes sort of indicates that Esther did not want her poetry to be published because the books are mostly destroyed when the ceiling collapses in the green room. And even though we don't know it for sure, it seems as if the spirit caused this. So we get her opinion in a way of what she thought of the poetry and of the books. So what did Esther want? Usually, when we read a ghost story and there's a spirit, a restless spirit, it's because that spirit has unfinished business or wants something from the living. What does Esther want in this situation? This is one of the points which you could either consider to be one of Delamare's strong points or one of his weaknesses, which is that he leaves this point ambiguous. We never really find out what Esther wanted. Did she want Alan to read her poetry? Was she trying to scare him away from reading her poetry? Was she intentionally exerting an influence over him? It's sort of said at one point that Alan has kind of fallen in love in a way with Esther. Was that something that she intended or wanted? Is she sort of greedy for affection? Is she greedy because she was rejected in life? So she's sort of trying to find acceptance or love in the afterlife? I don't really know. The ambiguity of the intention of spirits or some sort of a supernatural entity is sort of a running theme in Delamare's work. I read one of Delamare's novels recently. I think it's his only supernatural horror novel that he wrote. It's kind of weird fiction. The novel is called The Return. And it's quite an interesting novel, although I have to say, perhaps like this story, it could have done with being edited to be a bit shorter than it actually was. It's a good idea, but I don't think it needed an entire novel to explore it. The plot of the novel is similar to The Green Room in the sense that there is a supernatural presence, entity, or a force of some kind, which is exerting an influence over the world, but the intentions and desires of that force are highly ambiguous. We never find out what they want or what it's about. So the plot of The Return is really pretty good. The execution of the actual book, I think, is not quite as good as I would have hoped. But the general plot of the book is that there's a main character. He is a regular guy, a family man, and he likes to go on walks in the evening. And one day he goes on a walk and happens to go past a graveyard that is particularly beautiful. And there is one grave which has a seat next to it. And it looks really nice. So the man sits down and he becomes overpowered with sleepiness and then lays down and falls asleep right next to this grave. And when he wakes up, his entire face and body has changed. His mind is exactly the same, but he looks completely different. And so to summarize, basically we find out that the grave which he fell asleep next to was of a man who was sort of a warlock or an occult practitioner, and he maybe had some mystical powers. And so it's implied that this man's spirit has possessed the main character, or is at very least trying to possess him to come back to life in a way. So, if you think that is a pretty awesome idea for a novel, You would be right, because it is, and I thought that too. The reality of the novel is completely different. It is far more about what it's like to be this man in this situation and how his family treat him differently, how his friends treat him differently, how it impacts him and his emotions and his internal state to be thrown into this situation where he looks completely different out of nowhere and he can't explain it, and everyone doubts whether he is really who he's saying he is. In terms of the actual plot in the story, we never find out what the intentions of the ghost in The Return are, or why this man's face changed, how it happened. All of those details remain a mystery. There is some hints at at these details, but it's never concretely explained. So in that sense, it's very similar to The Green Room. Delamere is not so much interested in explaining the facts of a ghost story as he is in the feelings and atmosphere that is evoked by it, by the happenings in the story, the unexplained happenings. You could say, in a sense, that this is really the essence of weird fiction. It's of weirdness is often conjured by the presence of a force that whose intentions is unexplainable. And so we see that in this story, except I have to say, while in other stories it can be used to great effect, I was a bit disappointed. I didn't feel as much of a sense of weirdness as I would have liked. The ghost really wasn't very sinister. She just sort of seemed to be there to kind of exert an influence on Alan, but not really to do a whole lot otherwise. It was far more about Alan's interpretation of the events and his feelings. So to sum up, I would say that overall, I actually quite like this story. I like the atmosphere. I like the pacing, even though it's slow. I like the method that Delamere used of explaining the backstory and the thoughts and feelings of the ghost in the story through poetry. That was pretty unique. I haven't actually seen anything like that been used before, but I really liked it. I thought it was good. One thing I've noticed with Delamere's stories is that he's not always very good at ending them. And I think this was the case with this story. I'm really not a fan of the ending. I think Delamere was going for a kind of semi-comical ending of the story. Mr. Elliot and his wife are sort of positioned as somewhat comic characters, particularly their interactions with one another, I think are meant to be comic. And Mrs. Elliot's entrance at the end of the story, sort of demanding her husband's attention, I think is meant to be comic. She's meant to be like a kind of domineering housewife. She's heard a ruckus and she's going to come in and demand to know what's happening. I don't think that actually works very well in the story, though. To me, it fell flat. I tried to inject it with the kind of emphasis that I think was intended, but it really just doesn't work. I would have preferred to have seen some kind of emotional resolution for Alan. As it was, we didn't really get that. Alan is going on somewhat of an emotional journey throughout the story, but it never really concludes or reaches any kind of a climax. He doesn't really learn anything about himself or about women, which might have been interesting if he had. The story just ends fairly abruptly, which is kind of a disappointment. But anyway, overall, I hope you enjoyed it. It's not a bad story by any stretch of the imagination, and I quite like Delamere's work. Now, on to some other news for the channel. If you've made it this far, then you're probably interested in audiobooks that will be coming in the future. So I haven't announced it yet or really said anything about it, but I've been hard at work on a full-length audiobook. It's a gothic horror novel from a fairly famous German poet and playwright and novelist, and it's never been made into an audiobook before, at least in English. So I've just finished the recording and editing of that. It's about 16 hours long overall, so it's pretty big. and I'm going to release it in the next few weeks. So stay tuned if you're interested in that. Also, I'm setting up a Patreon account. And what I'm going to do, or what my plan is to basically remaster many or all of my old audiobooks and make them available through Patreon. So basically, you can subscribe for a few dollars, and then you will get access to all of the audiobooks that I've made in up-to-date remastered versions, which will sound a lot better than the versions that are on YouTube. You'll also have the ability to download any of my audiobooks. So basically, if you sign up for a few dollars, you'll get access to everything I've ever done, which is a pretty good deal. So if you're interested, keep an eye out. I will start advertising or spruiking it a little bit so people know that it's going to happen. But I thought I would just say it here first. So that's basically everything from me for now. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Look out for the next one. If you haven't already, maybe like the video or leave a comment or share it with other people on social media. That really does, that really goes a long way to helping the channel. All right, so that's all for me for now. Hope you have a good day. See ya.